Part 1. The New Neighbor. When the old Miller house finally sold, the whole neighborhood buzzed with curiosity. The place had been vacant for years, left to rot on the corner of Maple and Fifth. Kids dared each other to peek through its grimy windows, claiming it was haunted. So, when a moving truck arrived one crisp autumn morning, the neighbors couldn't help but watch from behind their curtains. I was on my front porch, pretending to read the paper, but really eyeing the new arrivals. The man unloading boxes was tall, with a gaunt frame and hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He wore a shabby trench coat and moved with a strange, stiff grace. His name was Mr. Graves, and he kept to himself, never more than a curt nod to acknowledge anyone. By the end of the week, whispers filled the air. "Have you seen Mr. Graves? So eerie, don't you think?" one neighbor would say. Another would add, "I swear I saw him digging in his backyard at midnight." The gossip was relentless, but no one dared to confront him. One night, as the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, I awoke to a faint rhythmic thumping. It was around 2 a.m., and the sound was coming from Mr. Graves' direction. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I slipped out of bed, pulled on a jacket, and crept to my window. Peering through the blinds, I saw him standing under the pale moonlight, methodically dragging what looked like a heavy sack towards the back of his property. The next morning, the Wilkins family reported their cat, Muffin, missing. They were distraught, plastering posters around the block and knocking on doors, but Muffin was nowhere to be found. A couple of days later, old Mrs. Hanson vanished. Her daughter came over, frantic and pale, asking if anyone had seen her mother. The police came, searched, and left with no leads. The following week, I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a mere suggestion of rot that wafted through the neighborhood. But with each passing night it grew stronger, more pungent, until it was impossible to ignore. People began to complain, but no one knew where it was coming from. One evening, as I sat on my porch trying to ignore the stench, I saw Mr. Graves again. He was standing at the edge of his property, staring directly at me. Our eyes locked, and for a moment I was paralyzed. There was something profoundly unsettling in his gaze, a darkness that sent chills down my spine. He raised a hand, not in greeting but in a slow, deliberate wave that felt more like a warning. That night I heard the screams. They pierced the quiet, shattering the stillness with a raw, primal terror. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, and rushed to my window. The screams seemed to come from all directions, an unearthly chorus of agony that echoed through the streets. I could see lights flicking on in houses up and down the block, shadows moving as my neighbors were drawn from their sleep by the same dreadful sound. I knew then that something was terribly wrong with Mr. Graves, and I feared that whatever dark secret he harbored was about to engulf us all. Part 2. Disappearances. The morning after the screams, the neighborhood was tense, like a collective breath held too long. Conversations were whispered, glances were suspicious, and an unspoken dread lingered in the air. No one wanted to admit that they were afraid, but it was clear that everyone was on edge. I found myself unable to focus on anything else. The strange sounds, the missing cat, and Mrs. Hanson's disappearance weighed heavily on my mind. As I walked to the corner store, I overheard snippets of conversations that mirrored my own fears. "Did you hear those screams last night? They sounded so close. I haven't seen Mrs. Hanson for days. Do you think she's all right?" The store itself felt different. Mr. Jenkins, the usually chatty shopkeeper, was unusually quiet, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. When I paid for my groceries, I asked him if he'd heard anything unusual. He just shook his head, eyes dark with concern. "People are scared. Something's not right around here," he muttered, bagging my items with trembling hands. That evening I decided to pay a visit to Mr. Graves. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but another part, the part that felt the icy grip of fear, just wanted to see if he acted strange. As I approached his house, the pungent odor of decay grew stronger, making me gag. I hesitated at his gate, my resolve wavering, but forced myself to knock on the door. It creaked open almost immediately, and there stood Mr. Graves, his hollow eyes staring down at me. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice as cold as the autumn air. I stammered. "I just wanted to introduce myself." "I'm your neighbor John?" He didn't respond, just stared at me for what felt like an eternity. Finally he stepped back and gestured for me to come in. The inside of his house was dimly lit and sparsely furnished, but what struck me most was the smell. It was overpowering, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. As I entered the living room, I noticed something odd. On a small table in the corner, There were several framed photographs of people I didn't recognize. They all had one thing in common: their eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions a mix of fear and sorrow. Mr. Graves noticed my gaze and chuckled, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Those are my family," he said, the hesitation in his voice unsettling. I tried to keep my voice steady. "You must miss them," I said, more a statement than a question. He nodded, eyes darkening. "Yes, terribly." The conversation was stilted, each word loaded with unspoken threats. After a few minutes of forced small talk, I made my excuses and left, relief washing over me as I stepped back into the cool night air. As I walked back home, I noticed something strange. In the garden behind Mr. Graves' house, there were several freshly turned mounds of earth. I felt a chill run down my spine and quicken my pace, the memory of those screams ringing in my ears. The next day, more neighbors went missing. The Johnsons, who lived 2 doors down, didn't show up for their morning walk. Their dog, Rex, was found wandering the streets, whimpering and disoriented. The police were called again, but their investigation seemed half-hearted at best. They took statements, asked questions, but it felt like they were just going through the motions. No one mentioned Mr. Graves, and I couldn't bring myself to speak up either. The fear of what he might do, of what he might be, kept me silent. That night, the screams returned, louder and more desperate than before. I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, clutching the covers and praying for dawn. When the sun finally rose, it brought little comfort. The neighborhood was unraveling, the sense of community replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I had to do something, but what? Confronting Mr. Graves seemed impossible, but ignoring the problem was no longer an option. Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate those mounds in his backyard. Whatever Mr. Graves was hiding, I needed to know. It was a dangerous decision, but I couldn't live in fear any longer. As night fell, I gathered my courage and set out, flashlight in hand. The wind howled through the trees, and the moon cast eerie shadows on the ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached his garden, the smell of decay growing stronger with each step. I reached the first mound and began to dig, the dirt cold and damp under my fingers. As I unearthed more soil, a horrifying realization dawned on me. Buried beneath the earth was the unmistakable shape of a human body. Part 3. Unveiling the Horror. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. I could barely believe what I was seeing. The mound was clearly hiding a body, and the thought that there could be more under the other mounds was almost too much to bear. My hands shook as I tried to decide what to do next. I had to alert the authorities, but first, I needed more proof. Steeling myself, I moved to the next mound. As I dug, the same pungent smell of decay assaulted my senses, making me gag. The flashlight beam wavered, casting grotesque shadows as I unearthed another horrific discovery, another body, its face twisted in an expression of terror. It was Mrs. Hanson. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there before Mr. Graves discovered me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard a soft, almost mocking voice from behind me. "Enjoying yourself, John?" I spun around, and there he was, Mr. Graves, standing just a few feet away. His eyes glinted with a malevolent amusement, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, taking a step closer. Fear paralyzed me for a moment, but then instinct kicked in. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the garden and back toward my house. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, but I didn't dare stop to retrieve it. I could hear Mr. Graves' footsteps behind me, steady and unhurried, as if he knew I couldn't escape him. I burst through my front door, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. My heart pounded in my ears as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I explained the situation, begging them to hurry. Minutes felt like hours as I waited, every creak and groan of the house making me jump. I peered through the curtains, scanning the street for any sign of Mr. Graves, but it was eerily quiet. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps had been. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car appeared, and I rushed outside to meet them. 2 officers approached, their faces serious, as I led them back to Mr. Graves' garden. I pointed out the mounds, my voice breaking as I described what I had found. The officers exchanged a grim look before they began to dig. It didn't take long before they uncovered the bodies. One of them radioed for backup while the other kept digging, finding more bodies under each mound. The total count was 6 by the time they finished, each one a neighbor who had mysteriously disappeared. As the officers secured the scene and began their investigation, I was taken to the station to give a formal statement. The shock of what I'd discovered left me numb, and I recounted the events in a daze. They assured me that Mr. Graves would be apprehended, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. I returned home, exhausted but unable to sleep. I kept replaying the night's events in my mind, wondering how someone so monstrous could have lived among us without anyone suspecting a thing. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat, but it was just one of the officers, come to inform me that Mr. Graves had been taken into custody. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The officer's next words sent a chill down my spine. He insists he's innocent, and we didn't find any evidence of him being involved with the bodies. I stared at him in disbelief, but I saw him. He was there. He knew what I was doing. The officer nodded sympathetically. "We believe you, John, but without concrete evidence linking him directly to the murders, it's going to be difficult to keep him detained." I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. If they couldn't hold him, what would stop him from continuing his gruesome activities? The thought of him being out there, watching, waiting, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. That night I bolted my doors and windows, unable to sleep. I kept a kitchen knife under my pillow, irrationally hoping it would protect me from the horrors lurking outside. The neighborhood was quieter than ever, the silence a stark contrast to the terror that had gripped us. The next few days were a blur of police investigations and media frenzy. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, their cameras capturing the morbid curiosity of the public. The neighbors, those who hadn't disappeared, spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact, as if acknowledging the horror would make it more real. Despite the police presence, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made my heart race. I knew Mr. Graves was still out there, and I feared it was only a matter of time before he struck again. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Johnson, her face pale and drawn. "John," she whispered urgently, "I think we need to talk." I invited her in, offering her a seat and a cup of tea. She looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might be listening. "I've been seeing things," she began, her voice trembling. "Strange things, shadows moving in the night. And I've heard voices whispering, calling my name. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, her eyes wide with fear. "I think it's him, John. I think Mr. Graves is somehow still watching us." As her words sank in, I realized the nightmare was far from over. The terror that had gripped our neighborhood was only just beginning, and I knew we had to find a way to stop Mr. Graves before it was too late. Part 4. The Haunting Begins, Mrs. Johnson's words haunted me long after she left. That night, I sat in my living room, the glow of the television failing to distract me from the creeping dread. Shadows danced on the walls, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, I finally went to bed, knife still under my pillow. Sleep came in fits, plagued by nightmares of hollow eyes and cold, mocking smiles. Sometime in the early hours, I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone prowling just outside my house. I crept to the window, careful to stay hidden behind the curtains. Peering out into the dim light of the street lamps, I saw a figure moving through the shadows. It was Mr. Graves. He moved with a strange, almost mechanical precision, his head turning as if searching for something or someone. Fear clutched at my throat, and I stepped back, trying to calm my racing thoughts. He shouldn't be out there. The police said they had no evidence, but surely they wouldn't have let him go so easily. I had to do something. I had to stop him. Grabbing my phone, I dialed the police, my voice a frantic whisper as I explained the situation. They assured me they would send someone to investigate, but it felt like an eternity before I saw the flash of red and blue lights. By the time the officers arrived, Mr. Graves was gone. The officers took my statement and searched the area, but it was clear they found nothing. Their expressions were sympathetic but doubtful, as if they thought my fear had gotten the better of me. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and left me with a stern warning to stay inside and keep my doors locked. The following days were a waking nightmare. Neighbors reported more strange occurrences, doors left open, objects moved, pets going missing. Each incident added to the growing tension, and the once friendly neighborhood now felt like a hostile, haunted place. I decided to take matters into my own hands. If the police couldn't or wouldn't help, I would have to find a way to protect myself and my neighbors. I began researching Mr. Graves, trying to find any clue that might explain his sinister presence. What I found was disturbing, Mr. Graves had no digital footprint, no social media, no records, nothing. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a friend who worked in private investigations. He agreed to help, and within a few days, he uncovered something chilling. Mr. Graves had changed his name several times over the past few decades. He had moved from town to town, always staying just long enough for people to start disappearing before vanishing himself. Each time, there were whispers of strange happenings and unexplainable deaths. Armed with this information, I went to the police again. This time, they seemed to take me more seriously. They promised to keep a closer watch on Mr. Graves and investigate his past. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. I had seen the look in his eyes, felt the malevolence that radiated from him. He wouldn't stop until he was caught, or worse, until he had finished whatever dark purpose he had in mind. One night, as I sat in my living room, poring over the documents my friend had given me, there was a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who would be visiting at this hour? I grabbed the knife from under my pillow and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "It's Mrs. Johnson," came the whispered reply. "Please let me in." Relief washed over me as I opened the door, but it was short-lived. Mrs. Johnson's face was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. "John, I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been in my house. I can feel it." I ushered her inside and locked the door behind her. "What happened?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I woke up to find my front door wide open. I know I locked it before I went to bed. And then I saw him, standing in my garden, just staring at the house. A chill ran down my spine. "Did you call the police?" She shook her head. "I was too scared. I didn't want to leave the house. I didn't know what to do." I handed her a cup of tea, trying to comfort her. "You did the right thing coming here. We'll figure this out." But even as I said the words, doubt gnawed at me. What could we do against someone like Mr. Graves? He seemed almost supernatural, a force of malevolence that defied explanation. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and fear. Mrs. Johnson stayed with me, too afraid to return to her own home. We slept in shifts, one of us always keeping watch. The neighborhood was in a state of high alert, with everyone on edge, jumping at every shadow. One night, as I kept vigil by the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Mr. Graves was standing at the edge of my property, his eyes fixed on the house. He made no move to approach, just stood there, watching. I felt a surge of anger. This had to end. Grabbing the knife, I stepped outside, determined to confront him. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the still night. Mr. Graves didn't respond. He just smiled, a cold, sinister smile that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't stop me, John," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will finish what I started." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, shaken and terrified. As I went back inside, I knew we had to find a way to stop him. But how do you fight something that seems more monster than man? Part 5. The Confrontation. The next morning I gathered the neighbors who were still around. We met in the Johnsons' living room, the air thick with fear and determination. Mrs. Johnson and I recounted our experiences, urging everyone to stay vigilant. We couldn't rely on the police. We had to protect ourselves. "I've been doing some research," I said, spreading the documents and photos across the coffee table. "Mr. Graves has a history. He's been doing this for years, moving from town to town. We need to find a way to stop him." The room buzzed with murmurs of fear and anger. We discussed setting up a neighborhood watch, taking turns patrolling the streets at night. It was a small comfort, but at least it was something. We agreed to keep an eye on each other's homes, to look out for anything suspicious. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I took the first shift. Armed with a flashlight and my trusty knife, I patrolled the streets, my senses on high alert. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, each house dark and silent. Hours passed without incident, and just as I began to think maybe tonight would be different, I heard a faint rustling behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest as I continued my patrol, every shadow and sound making me jump. Then I saw him. Mr. Graves stood at the end of the street, his face barely visible in the dim light. His eyes locked onto mine, and a slow, sinister smile spread across his face. He raised a hand in that mocking wave and then turned, disappearing into the night. I ran after him, driven by a mix of fear and fury. "Graves, stop!" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty street. But he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. When my shift ended, I returned home, my mind racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. Mr. Graves was playing with us, and I feared what he might do next. The next day, I contacted my friend in private investigations again, asking for any additional information he could find. He promised to dig deeper, but warned me to be careful. "This guy sounds dangerous, John. Don't do anything reckless." But I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to do something. That night, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I armed myself with the knife, a flashlight, and my phone, and set out for Mr. Graves' house. As I approached, the smell of decay hit me, stronger than ever. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I forced myself to step inside. The house was dark and silent, the air heavy with the stench of death. I crept through the rooms, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. In the living room, the photographs I had seen before seemed to glare at me, their eyes following my every move. I moved towards the basement door, the smell growing stronger with each step. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, pulling the door open with a groan. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the flashlight beam flickering in the stale air. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a room filled with horrors. The walls were lined with shelves, each one holding jars filled with dark, murky liquid. My flashlight revealed their contents: organs, bones, and other grotesque trophies. In the center of the room, a large table was covered with various tools, stained with blood. I felt bile rise in my throat, but I forced myself to keep looking. I had to find something, anything, that could stop Mr. Graves. As I searched the room, I found a small, leather-bound journal. I opened it, the pages filled with Mr. Graves' meticulous handwriting. The journal detailed his gruesome activities, his twisted experiments, and his belief that he could harness the power of life and death. He described his victims, the rituals he performed, and the dark force he claimed to control. Suddenly, I heard footsteps above me. My heart raced as I realized Mr. Graves had returned. I shoved the journal into my bag and turned off the flashlight, plunging the basement into darkness. I hid behind a shelf, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs. Mr. Graves entered the room, humming a tuneless melody. I watched through the shadows as he moved to the table, examining his tools with a detached interest. He paused, his head tilting slightly as if sensing my presence. "John," he called softly, his voice echoing in the small space. "I know you're here. There's no use hiding." Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay still. I couldn't let him find me. I had to get out, had to warn the others, but how? The only way out was past him, and he stood between me and the stairs. "Come out, John," he continued, his voice silky and sinister. "You're only making this harder on yourself." As he moved closer, I realized I had no choice. I had to confront him. I tightened my grip on the knife, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, I leapt from my hiding place, knife raised. Mr. Graves turned, his eyes widening in surprise. I lunged at him, the blade slicing through the air, but he was fast, faster than I anticipated. He sidestepped, grabbing my wrist and twisting it painfully. The knife clattered to the floor as I cried out in pain. "Foolish," he hissed, his grip like iron. "You think you can stop me?" Desperation fueled my next move. I kicked out, catching him in the shin. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled for the stairs, my heart in my throat. Mr. Graves lunged after me, but I was faster. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me. I raced through the house, out the front door, and into the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my house, my mind reeling from the encounter. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. This time they took me seriously. Within minutes, the neighborhood was swarming with officers, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Mr. Graves' house was searched thoroughly, and the evidence was overwhelming. The jars, the tools, and the journal all pointed to his guilt. He was arrested, taken away in handcuffs, his eyes still burning with that malevolent fire. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with a lingering fear. Mr. Graves was gone, but the horrors he had inflicted on our neighborhood would not be easily forgotten. We were left to pick up the pieces, to try and rebuild our sense of safety. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to heal. The missing were mourned, their families finding some solace in knowing their loved ones' fates. The house on Maple and Fifth was boarded up, a grim reminder of the terror that had once lived among us. But even as life returned to a semblance of normalcy, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Mr. Graves had been stopped, but his dark legacy lingered, a shadow over our community. And deep down I knew that some horrors could never be fully vanquished. Part 6. The final revelation. Weeks passed since Mr. Graves' arrest, and the neighborhood began to settle back into a wary calm. The once vacant Miller house now stood as a grim monument to the horrors we had uncovered. It was a reminder that even the most peaceful places could harbor unimaginable darkness. One evening, I decided to go through the journal I had taken from Mr. Graves' basement. I needed to understand more about him, about the rituals he had described. As I read through the pages, I noticed a recurring name, an ancient entity called Nihil, which Graves believed he could summon and control through his gruesome acts. The journal detailed how Mr. Graves had performed ritualistic killings to gain the entity's favor, believing that Nihil could grant him eternal life and power. I shuddered at the thought of such malevolence residing within our midst. As I delved deeper into the journal, I found a map of the neighborhood. Certain houses were marked with red X's, including mine. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Graves had planned his victims meticulously, choosing them for reasons only he understood. One night, as I was reading, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and I felt a familiar sense of dread creeping over me. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the breaker, but nothing seemed out of place. The unease grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I went to the window and looked out into the dark street. There, standing under the flickering street lamp, was a figure. My heart pounded in my chest as I recognized him, Mr. Graves. But that was impossible. He was in jail, wasn't he? The figure stepped closer, and I saw that it wasn't exactly Mr. Graves. It was as if his features had been distorted, twisted into something even more sinister. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and a cruel smile played on his lips. "You can't stop me, John," the figure hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. "I will finish what I started." I stumbled back, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating, a result of all the stress and fear. But the figure outside seemed all too real. I bolted the doors and windows, my mind racing. I knew I had to find help, but who would believe me? The police already thought I was paranoid, and my neighbors were just beginning to recover. I couldn't drag them back into this nightmare. As I tried to calm my racing thoughts, I remembered something from the journal and incantation that Graves believed could banish Nihil. It was a long shot, but it was the only hope I had. I grabbed the journal and found the page, my eyes scanning the ancient words. Gathering my courage, I began to recite the incantation, my voice trembling. The air grew thick and cold, and the house seemed to close in around me. Shadows danced on the walls, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. The figure outside the window drew closer, its eyes burning with rage. I kept chanting, forcing the words out even as fear threatened to choke me. The growl grew louder, a cacophony of voices joining in, but I didn't stop. Suddenly the figure at the window let out a scream, a sound of pure, unearthly terror. It writhed and twisted, its form dissolving into darkness. The growl faded, replaced by an eerie silence that settled over the house. I collapsed onto the floor, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. The power flickered back on, casting a warm light over the room. I glanced around, half expecting to see the figure still lurking, but it was gone. The next morning I went to the police with the journal. They listened, their skepticism replaced with a grudging belief as they saw the evidence of Graves' madness. They promised to keep investigating, to ensure that he would never pose a threat again. The neighborhood slowly began to heal, the shadow of Mr. Graves fading but never truly disappearing. We resumed our lives, but the scars remained, a reminder of the darkness we had faced. I kept the journal, a grim memento of the ordeal. Occasionally, I would flip through its pages, trying to make sense of the horrors it described. I knew that some mysteries would never be solved, and some evils could never be fully vanquished. But as I looked around at my neighbors, people who had come together in the face of terror, who had found strength in their unity, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had faced the darkness and survived. And while Mr. Graves' shadow might linger, we knew that as long as we stood together, we could overcome anything. Still, every now and then, I would find myself waking in the middle of the night, the echoes of those dreadful footsteps reverberating in my mind. And I would wonder, was it truly over? Or had Nihil found another vessel, another soul to corrupt and control? The thought was chilling, but I pushed it aside. We had faced the nightmare and lived to tell the tale. For now, that was enough. and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, as a community. Because in the end, that was the true power we had discovered, not in ancient incantations or dark rituals, but in the bonds of friendship and the strength of unity. And with that knowledge, I found the courage to face whatever darkness the future might bring.